I've always preferred a gaming controller to a mouse and a keyboard. Yes, a mouse is more accurate, but a controller is much more comfortable, and you get motion controllers, you get vibrations and even touch inputs, all of which immerse you so much more in the game than a regular mouse and keyboard can. Now, the first PS1 controller, the original DualShock, was one of the most iconic controllers ever to be released. It had vibration feedback, which back in 1997 was a huge deal. It had dual joysticks and symmetrical buttons, which I've always preferred. Then the DualShock 2, which was released with the PlayStation 2 back in 2000, wasn't really that big of an upgrade. You see, it had pretty much the same style design, just a bit slimmer, a bit lighter, and came in black, but all the main buttons were actually pressure sensitive now, so that was basically the biggest change. So the more you press the triggers, for example, the faster your car would start driving and things like that. Then came the DualShock 3 with the PlayStation 3, and the DualShock 3 was the first big change in a Sony controller. It was Sony's first fully wireless controller. It featured 6-axis motion sensing, so basically a gyroscope that could sense the direction and the orientation that you held the controller at, and you could play certain games that way and even use the controller itself as a racing wheel, so yeah, really cool stuff. And it also featured a mini USB port for charging and connecting it to other devices, such as a PSP, a PlayStation Portable, or even a full PC by using some third-party apps. And then, in 2013 when the PlayStation 4 was released, we got an even bigger update to Sony's line of game controllers, and that was the DualShock 4. Not only did the DualShock 4 feature the first big design change in a Sony controller, but it also came with a ton of major features. The start and select buttons were replaced with options and share. We also got a built-in speaker for some sound effects that your controller would actually play when, let's say, you were reloading or firing a gun. That was pretty cool. And then we also got an actual touchpad on the controller itself, which would not only be used in games, but also in a web browser as a mouse. And it was also its own pressable button, by the way. We got redesigned joysticks that were now concave rather than convex. It came with a massive light bar on the back for not only giving you a visual feedback of what was happening in your game. For example, if the light turned red, then that meant that your health was critical. But that light was also used for 3D depth tracking with the PlayStation camera and the PlayStation VR headset, which was later released. We got a micro USB port from the mini USB that we had before, and we even got something that was by far my favorite feature, and that was a 3.5mm headphone jack. Yes, you can now plug in any headphones that you wanted directly in the controller itself. How amazing was that? So yes, the PS4 controller, the DualShock 4, was the biggest change ever that Sony has ever made so far in a controller. So now what about the DualShock 5, the PS5 controller? Well, we've actually had a few leaked images that give us a glimpse at the PS5 controller. The first one was posted by Ray Sekiro on Twitter, and this one shows a very weird looking controller. Yeah, probably the first two things that you've noticed right away are the weird indented shape of the bottom of the controller itself and that integrated display. But there's quite a few more things that do stand out. So the directional arrow keys, for example, on the left have now been redesigned. They're slimmer, a bit taller, and the arrow symbols are now on the inside of the keys rather than on the outside. The PlayStation symbols, the square, the circle, the triangle, and X, or cross, they seem to be the same as before. Maybe a bit more raised, but yeah, it's quite hard to tell from this image. The share and option buttons are now horizontal rather than vertical, and it seems like we also have two instead of just one speaker grills on each side of the display. And I'm not fully sure how well you can see this, but the L1 and the R1 buttons, so the triggers, they seem to have been redesigned as well, and they're quite a bit larger now. And it seems to me that the 3.5mm headphone jack and the proprietary connector, or at least a USB Type-C port, they do seem to be located on the bottom of the controller, just like on the PS4 one. Okay, now let's talk about the two elephants in the room: the display and the shape of the controller. But first, don't forget about the AirPods Pro giveaway and the Google Pixel 4 giveaways that we're currently doing, so full details on both in the description box down below. Okay, so now when it comes to the display, the whole idea behind it is for it to be an upgrade to the touch panel that we had with the PS4 controller. And I can definitely see this happening. The display would allow you to see certain elements of a game, such as the inventory or the in-game party or chat, just like we have in this image here. And I do think that it would be something very useful to have, since at the moment, if you want to chat with your friends via text, you can indeed connect your phone to the PlayStation, but that does take quite some time to do, and typing using that joystick is just a nightmare. So, something like this would speed up the typing process by a lot. Okay, so the only question is, what impact will this have on the battery life? Well, it should have quite a significant one. And considering that the PS4 controller is pretty well known for a not so great battery life, well, this isn't looking great for the PS5 controller. However, if we take a look at the Nintendo Switch Pro controller, for example, this is by far the best controller on the market when it comes to the battery life. And right on par, by the way, with the Xbox One Elite 2 controller, both offering a staggering 40-hour battery life. But I mean, even 10 hours would be enough, as long as Sony manages to add everything that they want to add in this controller, and I would say that that's actually perfectly doable, especially considering that a PS4 controller, by the way, uses Bluetooth 2.1, which is ancient, and nowadays we have Bluetooth 5.0, which is significantly more power efficient, and by 2020 we should have Bluetooth 5.2, by the way. And, you know, this combined with the more efficient batteries and the chips, I would say that 10 hours with everything included in this controller, including the display, is doable. Now, onto the second elephant. So, yeah, when it comes to the shape, yes, it does look to be extremely uncomfortable, judging by how the bottom bit is a bit lower than the top portion. So, I don't know, it's one of those things where I would need to hold this in my hand to see for myself how comfortable or uncomfortable it really is. But something that you should keep in mind is that this is not the final version of the PS5 controller, no. This is very likely a dev kit controller that would work alongside the developer's kit that I showed you guys in the previous video exclusively. So yeah, make sure to watch that one in case you want to learn more about the actual PlayStation 5, as this video is mostly focused on the controller itself. So the final version will be more polished with a thinner design and possibly without that indented part towards the bottom. Now, when I first saw this image, I was like, this might be a render. However, I don't think it is, because of two reasons. So the first one being that, you know, we actually make 3D renders here at Xenotech, and well, this PS5 one, the controller, is probably the best one that I have ever seen. Like, this is very, very well done. And it's also an extremely difficult shape to do, so if this is a render, it's probably the best one I've ever seen. And then two, there were actually multiple leaked photos of this controller from many other sources, and yep, they all look the same. Here's another photo from Twitter user Tidux that shows this PS5 controller next to an early PS5 development kit unit. And then we have this other image that was posted on Reddit that again shows the same controller from a different angle. And yes, they could all be renders made by the same person that decided to share it with random people, but I don't think that's the case. You see, if we take a look at the actual photo of a real PS4 dev kit controller from back in the day, you can see that this one was, well, similar to the PS5 one, as in it was big, it was thick, it was chunky, so it had that chunky form factor, which we all know how much thinner and, you know, more sleeker the end unit actually ended up being. However, the main characteristics of the controller still remain, such as the overall design from the front, the button layout, the touch bar, and even the light bar, even though it did look more squared off in the dev kit model. Now, we actually made our own PS5 controller 3D model as a merge between the PS4 controller and the PS5 dev kit controller. So we still have the overall same PS4 controller design, just with slightly longer handles. We do have the built-in display, the horizontal option and share buttons, the light bar on the top, which we've actually made bigger than the PS4 one for even easier tracking from a greater distance. We have the dual speakers to the side of the display, and